Be doing the lesson on reproductive hormones. So we're first going to go through the male reproductive system, and then we're going to go through the female reproductive system. And you'll see that a lot of the hormones that are used in the male reproductive system are also found in the female reproductive system. So there's some common themes throughout this lesson. First of all, for males, near the testes, we've got seminiferous tubules and interstitial cells, which are located between the tubules, and this is where sperm is produced. So we've got interstitial cells producing testosterone, and the sperm is produced in the tubules and nourished by something called Sertoli cells. Now the Sertoli cells are going to come up a little bit later, but first let's talk about one of the very important hormones for the male reproductive system, which is testosterone. So testosterone's job is to stimulate the creation of sperm. Also, testosterone takes care of a lot of the secondary sex characteristics that we see at puberty, like deeper voices, muscle development, body hair, acne, and so on. It's also responsible for the development of the testes and the penis, and levels of testosterone are associated with sex drive. So how is testosterone controlled? Well, again, we've got the pituitary and the hypothalamus showing up again, which control the release of the male sex hormones and therefore sperm production in males. So the pituitary produces and stores something called gonadotropic hormones, which are the male follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and the male luteinizing hormone, or LH. So these two are going to come up both for males and for females, and they're going to do kind of similar jobs in both of those, in both genders. And over here, this diagram is pretty helpful too, because this one shows all of the hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary. So we've got thyroid-stimulating hormone, ACTH to the adrenal cortex, FSH and LH, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, are going to be the ones that we're going to focus on today. But we've also got growth hormone and so on and so on. So at puberty, the hypothalamus signals the anterior pituitary to start releasing this FSH and LH. And how it does that is the hypothalamus releases GnRH, or gonadotropic releasing hormone. So gonadotropic releasing hormone is the signal to the anterior pituitary to start releasing FSH and LH, which are going to be responsible for sperm production and testosterone production in males. So the luteinizing hormone, LH, stimulates those interstitial cells to increase testosterone production. Now testosterone increases sperm production, and high levels of testosterone feed back to the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus and inhibit the release of more luteinizing hormone. At the same time, follicle-stimulating hormone stimulates the seminiferous tubules to produce sperm directly. So sperm and eggs are both considered follicles in the male and female reproductive systems. So the follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, is producing sperm or stimulating the production of sperm more directly. And then sperm's producing cells release a hormone called inhibin, which feeds back to the anterior pituitary and inhibits the release of follicle-stimulating hormone. Okay, so here's the diagram. So at puberty, gonadotropic releasing hormone will start to be produced, which is going to signal the anterior pituitary to start releasing luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. So luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate sperm production kind of indirectly by stimulating the Leydig cells in the testes. You're not responsible for Leydig cells, but basically stimulating the cells that are going to produce testosterone. And testosterone has a positive feedback on the seminiferous tubules and the Sertoli cells that are going to be producing sperm. So in a roundabout way, luteinizing hormone produces or stimulates the production of testosterone, and testosterone then stimulates the production of sperm. So here we've got the word spermatogenesis, which is basically the term we're going to use for making sperm. Now, at the same time, that gonadotropic releasing hormone in the anterior pituitary also stimulated the release of follicle-stimulating hormone. And follicle-stimulating hormone directly stimulates the Sertoli cells in the seminiferous tubules to go through spermatogenesis and make sperm. So the follicle-stimulating hormones are stimulating sperm production somewhat more directly than the luteinizing hormone. All right, now let's talk about negative feedback. The Sertoli cells in the seminiferous tubules are going to release inhibin. Now, inhibin is going to have a negative feedback on follicle-stimulating hormone. So if we have an excess of sperm, the sperm-producing cells release inhibin, and that shuts down production of FSH. Now, the luteinizing hormone, if it produces an ample amount of testosterone, that's going to have a positive feedback on producing more sperm, but it's also going to have a negative feedback on luteinizing hormone and gonadotropic releasing hormone. So ample supplies of testosterone are going to shut down the hormones that are stimulating these Leydig cells and shut down the production of more testosterone. Okay, so the female reproductive system, instead of testes, we have ovaries. And an ovary contains follicles, which are groups of cells surrounding an ovum, or an egg. The follicular cells nourish the egg and produce the female hormones estrogen and progesterone. And at puberty, women have about 400,000 follicles, and not all of those are going to reach maturation, but essentially at puberty, females have all of the eggs that they're going to be developing throughout their entire life. So with men, the reproductive hormones are a little bit more constant throughout life. For females, the hormone levels fluctuate throughout their reproductive years all the way until menopause. The chances of having offspring with genetic disorders increases with a mother's age, as well the likelihood of becoming pregnant becomes a little bit more difficult with a mother's age. Now, menopause is when female sex hormones cease to be secreted, and that signals the end of the reproductive life for women, and it's a very gradual process. So males, like I said, produce sperm at a constant rate, but females go through a monthly cycle where one follicle and egg matures more than the rest, and an egg gets released through a process called ovulation. So what happens when an egg gets released through ovulation, the cells that surround it form something called the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum secretes hormones that are essential for pregnancy. But if pregnancy doesn't occur, the corpus luteum breaks down. And we're going to go through all of this kind of in detail with a couple of diagrams here. But the corpus luteum degenerates after about 10 days if a pregnancy doesn't happen. And the menstrual cycle lasts about 28 days and occurs in phases that are regulated by gonadotropic releasing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. So really similar to the same hormones that are released in the male system. So first off, the ovarian cycle begins with the release of gonadotropic releasing hormone by the hypothalamus. And the gonadotropic releasing hormone stimulates the pituitary to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone into the bloodstream. So that GnRH is doing the same job for women as it is for men. So here's the monthly cycle for women. The beginning of the cycle is called the flow phase, and that lasts about 5 days, where we get the shedding of the endometrial lining. So here's a few different diagrams which are all lined up along the 28 days of the women's cycle. We've got the fluctuation of gonadotropic levels, so luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which you guys can see peaks around 14 days and just before ovulation actually. So this dashed line is ovulation, and that's stimulated by the increase in follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. We also have estrogen and progesterone, and here we've got the ovarian cycle. So we have a follicle, so one of those 400,000 follicles, which is starting to grow, and as it grows, eventually it goes through ovulation. So the egg is released from that follicle, and the follicle then forms the corpus luteum, which, if a pregnancy doesn't occur, the corpus luteum degenerates, and the cycle starts again. So here we've got the follicular phase. So days 6 to 13 after the shedding of the endometrial lining, the follicles are developing. The hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary, which releases follicle stimulating hormone, and that stimulates follicle cells to mature and release estrogen. Now, estrogen causes the endometrial lining of the uterus to thicken in preparation for an egg being implanted, and it also inhibits the release of follicle-stimulating hormone from the pituitary, and it stimulates luteinizing hormone release. So after the follicular phase, we have ovulation. Ovulation is caused by an increase in luteinizing hormone, which causes the ovulation of the most mature ovum around day 14 of the cycle. So the most mature egg is going to be released by that follicle, and the egg's going to get caught by something called the fimbriae of the fallopian tubes. And so the egg will start traveling down the fallopian tubes towards the uterus. At that time, there's a slight dip in estrogen levels, and birth control pills contain high levels of progesterone, which inhibits ovulation and therefore prevents conception. So in this diagram, we've got a bit of a summary of that. The hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases follicle stimulating hormone, which is going to stimulate the growing follicle. It's also going to produce luteinizing hormone. Now, the growing follicle produces estrogen, and increased estrogen levels are going to have a negative effect, so it's going to have a negative feedback on follicle stimulating hormone. So the growing follicle is going to signal that no more follicle stimulating hormone is needed. But at the same time, the estrogen is going to increase or have a positive feedback on the production of luteinizing hormone. Now, the luteinizing hormone is what's going to cause ovulation and the release of that mature egg. The luteinizing hormone is also going to be helping with the production of the corpus luteum. And then the corpus luteum produces progesterone and some estrogen. Now, if progesterone is detected from the corpus luteum, then that has a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary, which is going to be decreasing the amount of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that's produced. It's also going to have a negative effect on the hypothalamus, so you won't be getting gonadotropin releasing hormone, which would be stimulating the production of these two. Okay, so after ovulation, we've got the luteal phase. So day 15 to 28, the remaining follicle turns into the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum secretes that progesterone and inhibin and a small amount of estrogen. The progesterone is responsible for building up the endometrium, or the uterine lining, and it inhibits further ovulation of other follicles, and it inhibits contractions of the uterus. So that's helping to prepare for pregnancy. No more eggs are going to be released in ovulation. The endometrium is going to build up, ready for the implantation of a fertilized egg, and the uterus is not going to contract, so the uterus won't be shedding the endometrial lining. Now, a buildup of progesterone and inhibin is going to also inhibit the further release of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and that causes the corpus luteum to deteriorate. If the egg is not fertilized, then the levels of estrogen and progesterone decrease and the endometrium degenerates, and that leads to the menstruation, or the shedding of the endometrial lining. Okay, so this diagram is a good summary, and if I were you guys, I would pause it and go back to the last slide and then back to this one to really look at how those hormones all interact with one another. All right, so what happens if fertilization in pregnancy actually happens? So an egg can be fertilized in the oviduct nearest to the ovary that it was released from. So that's as it's traveling down the fallopian tube. And if it's not fertilized during that 12 to 24-hour period in that location, the egg is going to disintegrate and die. In order to fertilize an egg, a sperm penetrates the egg, and the tail is detached, and the head of the sperm is engulfed by the cytoplasm of the egg. And so then, if you guys remember from last year, we talked about how the sperm cell is carrying half of the DNA for the child, and the egg is carrying the other half. Okay, now the sperm that enters the egg releases nitric oxide, which stimulates the release of calcium that's stored in the egg, and that prevents other sperm from entering the egg. So once one sperm enters the egg, no other sperm are going to be able to enter that egg. The embryo, so the developing egg, secretes something called HCG, which is a hormone that keeps the corpus luteum in the ovary from breaking down. It also suppresses the mother's immune system to prevent it from rejecting the baby. So it's the presence of that HCG which is detected in pregnancy tests. That's what we look for. And if HCG is detected, well, it means that an embryo is developing. Now, the corpus luteum, if it's not broken down because HCG is present, the corpus luteum keeps the estrogen and progesterone at high levels, which maintains the uterine lining for implantation, and it prevents menstruation. Okay, so that's it for that PowerPoint. Hopefully that video helped, and I will see you guys on Wednesday. We're going to do a quiz on the endocrine system and our hormones that we've been covering, and I think we're going to be ready for that one on probably Thursday, but we'll talk more about that one on Wednesday. Okay, have a good day.